The conference room felt like a tomb when Sophia Manning slammed the folder onto the mahogany table. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against the surface as she leaned forward, her voice dripping with accusation. "We know you've been spending company money on training courses." The CEO's niece snapped, her designer blazer catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You're terminated." I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out my security badge, and placed it gently beside her folder. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Then I smiled. "You have 4 hours until everything stops running. Tell everyone. 18 months earlier, I never could have imagined this moment. My name is Carissa, and back then, I was a 31-year-old woman starting fresh after a messy divorce that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust. When Robert Manning personally called to offer me the IT operations manager position at Midcorp Technologies, it felt like the universe was finally throwing me a lifeline. Midcorp wasn't a tech giant, but it was solid. A mid-size software company with about 200 employees, specializing in data management solutions for businesses across the Midwest. Robert had built it from a garage startup 23 years ago into a company generating $45 million annually. What struck me immediately about him was his genuine warmth. During my interview, he didn't just ask about my technical skills. He asked about my goals, my vision for growing in the field, my thoughts on emerging technologies. "I believe in investing in people," he told me that first day, gesturing around his corner office, decorated with photos of company retreats and employee achievements. "When you grow, the company grows. I want you to pursue every training opportunity that makes sense. Don't let budget constraints hold you back from becoming the best version of yourself." Those words meant everything to a woman who'd spent years watching her ex-husband dismiss her career ambitions. Robert wasn't just offering me a job paying $75,000 a year with full benefits. He was offering me respect and the chance to rebuild my professional confidence. My role at Midcorp was expansive and critical. I managed the entire cloud infrastructure that kept our 200 employees connected and productive. I maintained relationships with 3 major vendors who provided everything from data hosting to cybersecurity monitoring. I implemented security protocols that protected sensitive client information for companies ranging from law firms to medical practices to school districts. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the support. When I suggested we needed enhanced cybersecurity measures after a competitor suffered a major data breach, Robert approved a $3,000 certification course without hesitation. When our cloud architecture needed upgrading to handle increased client demand, he sent me to a $2,500 advanced training program in Chicago. When I mentioned wanting to develop leadership skills to better manage our growing IT team, he enrolled me in an $1,800 professional development seminar. Each investment paid dividends. The cybersecurity certification helped me identify and patch vulnerabilities that could have cost us millions in breach penalties. The cloud architecture training enabled me to design a system that increased our capacity by 60% while reducing costs by $20,000 annually. The leadership development gave me the confidence to mentor junior staff and streamline our help desk operations. For over a year, everything felt perfect. I had found my professional home, working for someone who valued both competence and growth. I was building something meaningful, contributing to a company culture where excellence was rewarded and innovation encouraged. Then Sophia arrived. She swept into Midcorp 6 months ago, with all the entitlement that comes from sharing DNA with the boss. Fresh out of business school with an MBA she never let anyone forget about, Sophia was appointed HR director despite having 0 actual human resources experience. Robert introduced her as my brilliant niece who's going to help us professionalize our people operations. From day one, the dynamic shifted. Sophia questioned everything I did with the kind of aggressive scrutiny that felt personal rather than professional. She challenged vendor contracts I'd negotiated, demanding explanations for routine maintenance costs that had been standard for months. She nitpicked my expense reports, requiring additional documentation for items that had never needed it before. "I'm just trying to understand how things work around here," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. But her questions felt like accusations, her suggestions like attempts to undermine my authority. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago when I submitted my quarterly vendor payments. These weren't new expenses or unusual costs. They were the same monthly fees we'd been paying Data Secure Solutions, Secure Vault Backup Services, and CyberGuard Pro cybersecurity monitoring for the past year. Amounts that Robert had personally approved and that had proven their value dozens of times over. Sophia called me into her new office, a space she'd redecorated with motivational posters and family photos featuring her and Robert at various family gatherings. She spread my expense reports across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. "These vendor payments seem excessive," she said, tapping her pen against each line item. "How do we know we're getting value for these amounts?" I explained our vendor relationships, the critical services they provided, the competitive rates we'd negotiated. I showed her the documentation proving we were paying below market rate for premium services that kept our systems running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. "I think we need to explore alternatives," she said dismissively. "Uncle Robert expects me to find cost savings wherever possible." Uncle Robert approved these vendors personally, I wanted to say. But something about her tone warned me that logic wouldn't penetrate whatever narrative she'd constructed in her mind. What I didn't realize then was that Sophia saw me as more than just another employee whose expenses she could scrutinize. She saw me as a threat to her influence over Robert. A reminder that competence earned trust more reliably than blood relations. Every training course Robert approved for me, every project he entrusted to my judgment, every compliment he paid, my work was evidence that his professional respect couldn't be inherited. The climactic twist that would change everything came during our final conversation before today's ambush. Sophia had requested a meeting to review my professional development expenses, pulling up records of the training courses Robert had enthusiastically approved. "Don't you think it's a bit suspicious that Uncle Robert seems to approve everything you request?" she asked, leaning back in her chair with studied casualness. "Some people might wonder about the nature of your relationship with him." The implication hit me like a physical blow. She was suggesting something inappropriate, something that diminished both my professional achievements and Robert's integrity. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about expenses or vendor relationships or cost savings. This was about a young woman who couldn't accept that trust and respect had to be earned, not inherited. But I underestimated just how far she was willing to go to eliminate what she perceived as a threat to her position in the family business. The meeting that would destroy my career began at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Sophia's assistant, a nervous woman named Beth who'd been with the company for 8 years, delivered the message with apologetic eyes. "Sophia needs to see you in the main conference room," Beth whispered, glancing around as if she was afraid of being overheard. "She said to bring any documentation related to your training expenses." I should have known something was wrong. Sophia had never requested documentation before. She had access to all expense records through our financial system. But I gathered my files anyway, assuming this was another attempt to question legitimate business expenses that had already been approved and processed. The main conference room was MidCorp's most formal space, reserved for client presentations and board meetings. Finding Sophia there instead of her office should have been another warning sign. She'd positioned herself at the head of the long table, surrounded by folders and printouts arranged with courtroom precision. "Please, sit down," she said without looking up from her papers. Her tone was different, colder, and more authoritative than I'd ever heard from her before. She was wearing her most expensive suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I took a seat halfway down the table, placing my folder of documentation within easy reach. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished surface between us. "I've been conducting a thorough review of company expenses," Sophia began, finally looking up to meet my eyes. "And I've discovered some very concerning patterns in your spending." She opened the first folder and began spreading papers across the table. At first glance, they looked like my expense reports, but something felt off about them. The amounts seemed wrong, inflated beyond what I remembered submitting. "These training courses," she continued, pointing to the first sheet. $4,500 for cybersecurity certification. $3,800 for cloud architecture training. $2,600 for leadership development. That's over $11,000 in just 6 months. I stared at the numbers. They were nearly double what I'd actually spent. Those amounts are incorrect, I said, reaching for my documentation. The cybersecurity course was $3,000. The cloud training was $2,500. And the leadership seminar was $1,800. I have all the original receipts. These are the amounts that were processed through our financial system, Sophia replied, her voice steady and confident. Are you suggesting our accounting department made errors? Before I could respond, the conference room door opened. Jacob Walsh, our security director, entered carrying a laptop and looking uncomfortable. Jacob had been a friend of Sophia's since college, something she'd mentioned several times since her arrival. Seeing him here felt like a betrayal, though I couldn't yet understand why. Jacob has been helping me investigate some irregularities, Sophia said as he took a seat across from me. Tell her what you found. Jacob opened his laptop and consulted his notes, avoiding eye contact with me. We noticed some unusual access patterns in the financial systems, he said quietly. Weekend logins, after-hours database queries, modifications to vendor payment schedules. My mouth fell open. I work weekends sometimes because that's when I can perform system maintenance without disrupting operations. Robert knows this. He specifically asked me to handle sensitive updates during off hours. Uncle Robert doesn't remember authorizing weekend work, Sophia interjected. And he certainly doesn't remember approving these excessive training expenses. The room felt like it was tilting. Robert had not only approved my training, he'd encouraged it. He'd personally signed off on each course, often adding notes about how the skills would benefit the company. But as I looked at Sophia's confident expression and Jacob's uncomfortable fidgeting, I realized they weren't interested in the truth. Where is Robert? I asked. I'd like to speak with him about these accusations. Uncle Robert is in meetings all afternoon, Sophia replied smoothly. He's asked me to handle this matter. Based on our investigation, we've determined that your employment with MidCorp Technologies needs to be terminated immediately. The word terminated hit me like a physical blow. 18 months of excellent performance reviews, successful projects, and grateful client feedback meant nothing to the woman sitting across from me with her fabricated evidence and family connections. You can't be serious, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. These accusations are completely false. I can prove every expense was legitimate and pre-approved. The decision has been made, Sophia said, closing her folders with finality. Jacob will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. Your access to all company systems has been revoked effective immediately. That last statement hit me like a revelation. My access had been revoked immediately. Not after this meeting, not pending the outcome of our discussion, but already, before I'd even been informed of the accusations against me. This wasn't an investigation or a disciplinary meeting. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to remove me from the company as quickly as possible. When was my access revoked? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This morning, he admitted, around 8:30. The meeting had been scheduled for 2:30 in the afternoon. They'd cut off my access to company systems 6 hours before they bothered to inform me why. This wasn't about protecting company assets or conducting a thorough investigation. This was about making sure I couldn't defend myself or access evidence that might contradict their narrative. So this was planned, I said, looking directly at Sophia. You decided to fire me before we ever had this conversation. We followed proper procedures for addressing financial irregularities, she replied. But there was something in her eyes that looked like satisfaction rather than regret. As Jacob escorted me to my office, past colleagues who stared with confusion and concern, I felt the weight of injustice settling on my shoulders. But underneath the anger and humiliation, something else was growing. A calm certainty that Sophia had made a critical error in judgment. She'd been so focused on removing me from the company that she hadn't bothered to understand what my removal would actually cost them. In 4 hours, she was about to discover that some bridges, once burned, take everything else down with them. The walk to my office felt like a funeral procession. Jacob walked beside me in uncomfortable silence, while curious colleagues watched from doorways and cubicles. Some offered sympathetic smiles, others looked confused, but everyone seemed to sense that something significant and terrible had just happened. My office was a corner space on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot where I'd arrive each morning with coffee and optimism about the day ahead. Now I was packing my personal items into a cardboard box while Jacob stood in the doorway, trying to look official but mostly just looking miserable. "Carissa, I'm really sorry about this," he said quietly while I emptied my desk drawers. "Sophia showed me all this documentation about irregular expenses and system access. I didn't know what to think." I paused in my packing to look at him. Jacob was a good guy who'd gotten pulled into something he didn't fully understand. "The documentation was fabricated," I told him. "Those expense amounts were inflated, and my system access was completely legitimate." Robert approved everything. His face showed the first flicker of doubt. But Sophia said Robert didn't remember approving the training courses. "Robert has personally congratulated me on completing each certification," I replied, placing my coffee mug and small cactus plant into the box. "He specifically told me that the cybersecurity training helped us avoid a potential data breach that could have cost millions." As I continued packing, my mind began cataloging everything that Sophia and Jacob didn't know about my role at MidCorp. It wasn't their fault, really. Most people assumed that IT management was just about keeping computers running and fixing technical problems when they arose. They had no idea about the complex web of relationships, access credentials, and specialized knowledge that kept a modern business functioning. The first critical element was the encryption system I'd implemented after our competitor suffered their data breach. Every client file, every archived document, every backup copy was protected by military-grade encryption that required specific authorization codes to access. Those codes weren't stored on company servers for security reasons. They were on my personal encrypted drive, updated monthly according to the 30-day rotation protocol that Robert had specifically requested. The second element was vendor relationships. Data Secure Solutions, our cloud hosting provider, had a personal relationship with me, going back 3 years to my previous job. Marcus Torres, their account manager, had my personal cell phone number and called me directly for any issues or maintenance windows. Secure Vault, our backup service, had similar arrangements. CyberGuard Pro, our cybersecurity monitoring firm, required personal authorization from the designated company contact for any major system changes. That designated contact was me. The third element was system documentation. In most companies, IT procedures are thoroughly documented so that multiple people can handle critical functions. But MidCorp had grown rapidly, and Robert had specifically asked me to prioritize security over documentation. "I trust your judgment," he'd told me 6 months ago. "Keep the sensitive information secure, even if that means fewer people have access. So the master passwords, the vendor emergency contacts, the detailed system configurations, and the encryption key schedules existed primarily in my personal files and my memory." It wasn't ideal from a business continuity perspective, but it was exactly what Robert had requested to minimize security risks. As these realizations crystallized, I began to understand why my cryptic warning to Sophia carried more weight than she could possibly imagine. The 4-hour timeline wasn't arbitrary. It was based on Data Secure's automated backup schedule, which ran every evening at 6:30. Without my authorization codes, the backup would fail. Without successful backups, any system failure could mean permanent data loss for dozens of clients. But the backup schedule was just the beginning of MidCorp's problems. Harrison Industries, our largest client, had a critical data migration scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Their project required accessing 5 years of archived contracts and financial records to complete a merger worth $50 million. The data was encrypted using my security protocols, accessible only with authorization codes that existed nowhere in Midcorp's official documentation. 3 other clients had urgent needs that depended on system access I alone could provide. Brennan and Associates, a law firm, needed archived case files for a trial beginning Monday morning. Metropolitan Medical Group required patient records for an FDA audit scheduled for Thursday. Riverside School District needed student transcripts and records for a state compliance review happening this week. All of their data was secure, protected, and completely inaccessible without my intervention. Standing in my office with a box of personal items, I felt the weight of this knowledge settling around me like armor. Sophia thought she'd eliminated a problematic employee who asked too many questions and threatened her influence with Robert. What she'd actually done was remove the keystone holding up the entire technical infrastructure of the company. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Torres at Data Secure. Carissa, getting some unusual error messages on the Midcorp account. Can you call when you have a chance? I looked at the message timestamp. 2:45 p.m. Less than 15 minutes after my termination meeting. The systems were already beginning to show stress fractures. Jacob was still standing in the doorway, watching me pack with obvious discomfort. Is there anything you need to tell me about the IT systems? He asked. Any passwords or procedures I should know about? I smiled at him. Not unkindly, but with a certainty that felt almost serene. Everything you need to know is thoroughly documented in the company's official files, I said. I'm sure Sophia will have no trouble managing things from here. He looked relieved, not understanding that my response was technically true but practically meaningless. The documentation existed, but it was encrypted, password protected, and stored in personal files that had just walked out the door with me. As we headed toward the elevator, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an automated alert from CyberGuard Pro's monitoring system. Security event detected. Multiple failed authentication attempts on client data servers. Someone was already trying to access systems they didn't understand with passwords they didn't have. The 4-hour countdown had begun, though I was probably the only person in the building who fully grasped what that meant. In 4 hours, everything would indeed stop running. The only question was whether anyone would figure out why before it was too late. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through downtown to give myself time to process what had just happened. My phone sat in the passenger seat, buzzing occasionally with what I assumed were more automated alerts from our vendor monitoring systems. I didn't answer. Technically, I was no longer employed by Midcorp Technologies, which meant I had no responsibility to respond to their technical emergencies. My apartment was a modest 1-bedroom place I'd moved to after my divorce, decorated with plants and books rather than expensive furniture. It felt like a sanctuary after the corporate ambush I'd just survived. I set my box of personal items on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea, trying to decide how I felt about everything that had happened. Angry, certainly. Hurt, definitely. But underneath those emotions was something unexpected. A calm sense of anticipation. Sophia had played a dangerous game without understanding the rules or consequences. Now we would all get to see how well her strategy worked in practice. At exactly 4:15, 2 hours after my termination, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Torres from Data Secure Solutions. Hey, Marcus, I answered, settling into my favorite reading chair by the window. Carissa, thank goodness. His voice was tight with stress. We've got a major situation with the Midcorp account. The automated backup routine failed with authentication errors, and when I called the main number, they transferred me to someone in HR who insisted she could handle it. That would be Sophia Manning, I said calmly. She's the new HR director. Right. Well, she didn't have any of the authorization codes we needed. Then she tried to guess the passwords, which triggered our security breach protocols. The system has automatically locked out all access attempts for 24 hours unless you personally authorize an override. I sipped my tea and watched traffic move past my apartment window. I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus, but I no longer work for Midcorp. They terminated my employment this afternoon. You'll need to work with their current staff to resolve any issues. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Carissa, you were our primary contact for the account. All the security protocols are tied to your authorization. If you're no longer with the company, we need to establish new contact procedures, but that typically takes 3 to 5 business days to process through our security department. I understand, I replied. I'm sure Sophia will figure something out. After we hung up, I realized this was just the beginning. Data Secure was the most critical vendor, but they weren't the only system that required my personal authorization. Over the next few hours, the cascade of failures would expand from backup services to email authentication to VPN access to client data retrieval. My phone stayed quiet for exactly 37 minutes. Then it exploded with activity. The first call was from Jennifer Brooks, the project manager at Harrison Industries. Her voice was tense with barely controlled panic. Carissa, we're trying to access the archived contracts for tomorrow's data migration, but the system keeps returning. Access denied errors. Our entire merger timeline depends on having that data available first thing in the morning. I explained that I was no longer with MidCorp and suggested she contact Sophia Manning for assistance. Jennifer's response was immediate and sharp. I tried that. She doesn't understand the system and keeps transferring me to different people. No one seems to know how to access the archives. The second call came from David Chen at Brennan & Associates law firm. His voice carried the kind of stress that comes from watching a critical deadline approach with no solution in sight. The case files we need for Monday's trial aren't accessible. When I call MidCorp, they keep telling me there's a technical issue, but no one can give me a timeline for resolution. The third call was from Dr. Sarah Williams at Metropolitan Medical Group. Our FDA audit is Thursday morning, and we can't access any of our patient records from the past 2 years. The MidCorp representative I spoke with seemed confused about our data storage arrangements. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Critical data was inaccessible. MidCorp staff didn't understand the systems well enough to provide solutions, and time-sensitive business operations were grinding to a halt. I provided each caller with Sophia's direct contact information and wished them luck, knowing that luck wouldn't solve their technical problems. Meanwhile, according to the automated alerts filling my phone, MidCorp's internal systems were experiencing their own cascade of failures. The VPN that allowed remote access for employees was rejecting authentication attempts. The shared file servers that stored collaborative projects were throwing permission errors. The email system was struggling with routing issues that stemmed from authentication database problems. At 5:30, exactly 3 hours after my termination, Robert Manning called my personal cell phone. Carissa. His voice was strained and desperate. I just got back from client meetings to find the office in complete chaos. Sophia told me what happened, but I don't understand. None of our systems are working properly. Clients are calling with urgent problems, and everyone seems to be panicking. I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for Robert. He'd built MidCorp from nothing, and now he was watching it crumble because of his niece's poor judgment. But sympathy wasn't the same as responsibility. I'm sorry to hear about the technical difficulties, I said carefully. I'm sure your current IT staff will be able to resolve everything. Carissa, please. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. I didn't authorize your termination. I wasn't even consulted about it. Sophia says she found evidence of financial irregularities, but I need to understand what's happening with our systems. Robert. I was accused of misusing company funds and terminated with immediate effect. My access to all systems was revoked hours before anyone bothered to explain why. I think it would be inappropriate for me to provide technical support under these circumstances. The line went quiet except for the sound of Robert's labored breathing. In the background, I could hear voices, phones ringing, and what sounded like general chaos. What would it take, he asked finally, for you to come back temporarily? Just long enough to stabilize the systems and transition your responsibilities properly? It was a reasonable question that deserved a thoughtful answer. First, I'd need a full apology and acknowledgement that the accusations against me were false. Second, I'd need written documentation that my termination was improper and that my employment record reflects no wrongdoing. Third, I'd need assurance that whoever orchestrated this situation faces appropriate consequences for their actions. Done, Robert said immediately. All of that. Whatever you need. Can you come back tonight? I looked out my apartment window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. In 1 hour, the data-secure backup system would attempt its nightly routine and fail catastrophically. Without those backups, MidCorp would be one system failure away from losing irreplaceable client data. I'll think about it, I told Robert. But Robert? You might want to ask Sophia exactly how she came up with those expense numbers she showed you. I think you'll find the investigation reveals some interesting irregularities. After I hung up, my phone immediately buzzed with a text message from Marcus Torres. Carissa, the backup failure is causing cascading issues with other systems. We're looking at potential data integrity problems if this isn't resolved within the next few hours. Please call when you can. I made myself another cup of tea and settled back into my chair. Outside, the sun was setting on what had started as an ordinary Tuesday and turned into something much more significant. In corporate conference rooms across the city, teams of lawyers and executives were probably scrambling to understand how their critical business operations had suddenly become hostage to the employment status of a single individual. The climactic twist was yet to come, but I was beginning to understand that this story wouldn't end with simple technical repairs and staff realignments. Sophia's desperation to remove me had exposed something much darker than nepotism or professional jealousy. Tomorrow, I would discover exactly what she'd been trying to hide. Unable to sleep, I spent the evening reviewing my personal copies of expense documentation, partly to prepare for potential legal action, and partly to understand exactly how Sophia had constructed her accusations against me. What I discovered in those files would change everything. Sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printed receipts, I began comparing Sophia's evidence against my actual expense records. The discrepancies were immediately obvious. Where I had submitted $3,000 for cybersecurity certification, her version showed $4,500. Where my cloud architecture training had cost $2,500, she'd inflated it to $3,800. Every single expense had been systematically altered to appear excessive and suspicious. But as I dug deeper into the alterations, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The extra amounts weren't random numbers designed to make my expenses look inflated. They were specific dollar figures that corresponded to other transactions in the company's financial records. The $1,500 difference in my cybersecurity training exactly matched a charge for something called Executive Leadership Retreat that had been processed in July. The $1,300 inflation of my cloud training corresponded to a consulting fee from August. The $800 bump to my leadership development matched a professional development expense from September. I started cross-referencing these mysterious expenses against public records, using my knowledge of MidCorp's vendor relationships and payment schedules to trace where the money had actually gone. What I found made me physically sick. The Executive Leadership Retreat was actually a luxury spa weekend at the Four Seasons Resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. The credit card statements showed charges for two-person accommodations, couples massage packages, and high-end dining. The dates corresponded exactly with a weekend when Sophia had mentioned visiting her boyfriend in Phoenix. The consulting fee was payment to Urban Elite Academy, which a quick internet search revealed was an expensive MBA program offering accelerated executive education for working professionals. Cross-referencing the dates with Sophia's social media posts showed photos of her in classroom settings with captions about investing in my professional growth. The professional development expense was the most brazen. It was payment to Premium Tech Solutions for a high-performance laptop system. The invoice specifications matched exactly with a gaming laptop that Sophia's boyfriend, a freelance graphic designer named Tyler, had posted about on his Instagram account with the caption, "New work setup courtesy of my amazing girlfriend." The pattern became sickeningly clear as I traced back through 6 months of financial records. Sophia had been systematically embezzling company funds by creating fake expense categories and inflating legitimate employee costs to hide her theft. She'd stolen money for personal travel, education, gifts for her boyfriend, even what appeared to be a security deposit for a luxury apartment. The total amount was staggering: $47,000 over 6 months. But the most damning discovery was why she'd targeted me specifically for termination. As IT operations manager with access to financial systems and a direct reporting relationship to Robert, I was the most likely person to notice discrepancies in expense reporting. My legitimate training costs provided the perfect cover story for dismissing me before I could discover her embezzlement scheme. At 6:45 a.m., my phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the caller ID, and his voice sounded like he hadn't slept all night. "Carissa, everything has completely fallen apart. The Harrison Industries project is dead in the water. 3 other clients are threatening to terminate their contracts, and our insurance company is asking questions about data security breach protocols. I need your help, and I'm willing to meet any terms you set." I had spent the early morning hours organizing my evidence of Sophia's fraud into a comprehensive file: bank records, altered expense reports, vendor invoices, social media posts, and credit card statements that painted a clear picture of systematic theft and deliberate framing of an innocent employee. "Robert, before we discuss my returning to work, there's something you need to know about Sophia's investigation of my expenses." I explained what I'd discovered, walking him through each falsified expense report and showing him exactly how his niece had been stealing from the company while simultaneously destroying the career of the person most likely to catch her. The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer and longer as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "I can't believe this," Robert finally whispered. "She's family. I trusted her with the financial oversight of the entire company." "The evidence is comprehensive," I told him. "I've documented everything, including the methods she used to alter my expense reports to create justification for firing me. But Robert, there's something else you should know. I've already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." That revelation hit him like a physical blow. "The FBI? I called them this morning with a full report of the embezzlement scheme. I've also notified the State Labor Board about wrongful termination, the company's insurance carrier about potential data breach exposure, and the ethics hotline about nepotism concerns in the hiring process." What Robert didn't know was that I'd made those calls before he contacted me, not after. I'd spent the hours between midnight and dawn preparing a comprehensive case that would protect me legally while ensuring that Sophia faced appropriate consequences for her actions. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. "Carissa, what can I do to make this right?" Robert asked, and I could hear the genuine anguish in his voice. "First, restore my access to all company systems immediately. Second, provide written documentation that my termination was improper and that my employment record reflects no wrongdoing. Third, ensure that Sophia is immediately suspended pending investigation of the financial irregularities. And fourth, recognize that I'll need significant compensation for the personal and professional damage caused by false accusations of financial misconduct." "Done," Robert said without hesitation. "All of it. Can you come in this morning?" "I'll be there in 2 hours," I told him. "But Robert, you should probably call your lawyers before Sophia arrives for work. The FBI will want to interview her today." As I hung up the phone and prepared to return to MidCorp, I felt a sense of justice beginning to unfold. The woman who'd tried to destroy my career to hide her own crimes was about to discover that some actions have consequences she never anticipated. The systems I could fix in 30 minutes. Sophia's future, on the other hand, was about to become much more complicated. Walking into MidCorp at 8:30 on Wednesday morning felt like returning to the scene of a crime where the perpetrator was about to be arrested. The parking lot was fuller than usual, with several cars I didn't recognize, including a black sedan with government plates parked near the main entrance. The lobby buzzed with nervous energy. Employees clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones and casting worried glances toward the elevators. "Beth," Sophia's assistant, sat at her desk looking pale and anxious. When she saw me, relief flooded her face. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said, rushing over to meet me. "Everything's been chaos since yesterday afternoon. Phones ringing constantly, clients threatening lawsuits." And Sophia locked herself in her office and won't talk to anyone. I made my way to Robert's office, where I found him on the phone with what sounded like damage control calls to angry clients. He gestured for me to sit while he finished promising someone that their data access issues would be resolved within the hour. Absolutely guaranteed. "Carissa," he said after hanging up, "I can't thank you enough for coming back. I've already had our IT team restore your access credentials, and I've prepared the written documentation you requested, acknowledging that your termination was completely improper." He slid a folder across his desk containing a formal letter on company letterhead. It stated clearly that I had been wrongfully terminated based on false accusations, that my employment record would reflect no disciplinary action or performance issues, and that the company took full responsibility for the improper investigation and dismissal. "Where's Sophia?" I asked. Robert's expression darkened. "She's in her office with Jacob Walsh and 2 FBI agents who arrived about an hour ago. They have a warrant for her financial records and access to her company computer systems." As if summoned by our conversation, the conference room door opened and Agent Patricia Stevens emerged, followed by her partner, Agent Michael Rodriguez, and a very pale Jacob Walsh. Agent Stevens was a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, who carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of investigating financial crimes. "Mr. Manning," Agent Stevens said, approaching Robert's desk, "we've completed our preliminary interview with Miss Manning and Mr. Walsh. We'll need to speak with you about the company's financial oversight procedures." "Of course," Robert replied. "Agent Stevens, I'd like you to meet Carissa Walker, the employee whose termination brought these irregularities to light." Agent Stevens shook my hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "Miss Walker, we've reviewed the comprehensive documentation you provided. It's some of the most thorough evidence compilation I've seen in a financial fraud case. The altered expense reports, cross-referenced bank statements, and timeline analysis made our investigation significantly more efficient. I just documented what I found," I replied. "I wanted to make sure the truth was clear." "The truth is very clear," Agent Rodriguez added, joining our conversation. "Miss Manning has admitted to altering company expense records to conceal unauthorized personal expenditures. The total amount of confirmed embezzlement is $47,312. Robert sank into his chair as if the weight of that number was physically crushing him. $47,000, he repeated quietly. "She stole $47,000 from a company I built with my own hands." The most shocking revelation came next. Agent Stevens consulted her notes and looked directly at Robert. "Mr. Manning, were you aware that Miss Manning had asked your security director to plant evidence in Miss Walker's office to strengthen the case for her termination?" The room went completely silent. Robert stared at Agent Stevens as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "She asked Jacob to do what?" "Plant falsified training receipts and unauthorized software in Miss Walker's desk to make the embezzlement accusations more credible," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Mr. Walsh refused to participate and has been cooperating fully with our investigation." That explained Jacob's discomfort during yesterday's termination meeting. He'd known that Sophia was planning something criminal, but he'd struggled with how to handle his loyalty to a college friend versus his professional integrity. Ultimately, his refusal to plant evidence had prevented the situation from becoming even worse. Over the next hour, I efficiently restored all the systems that had failed during my 17-hour absence. I contacted Marcus Torres at Data Secure and authorized the emergency override that restored backup functionality. I called Jennifer Brooks at Harrison Industries and personally walked her through accessing the archived contracts her team needed for their morning data migration. I reached out to David Chen at Brennan & Associates, Dr. Sarah Williams at Metropolitan Medical Group, and officials at Riverside School District to confirm that all their critical data was now accessible. What had taken hours to break took me 37 minutes to fix, demonstrating to everyone present just how irreplaceable my knowledge and vendor relationships truly were. The final confrontation came at 11:15, when FBI agents escorted Sophia from her office to the parking lot in handcuffs. I watched from Robert's office window as she was placed in the back of the black sedan, her designer suit and confident demeanor replaced by an orange jumpsuit and stunned disbelief. She looked up at the building before the car pulled away, and for a moment, our eyes met through the window. In her expression, I saw recognition that her attempt to destroy my career had instead exposed her own crimes and destroyed her future. Agent Stevens provided us with the final details before leaving. Miss Manning will be charged with embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted evidence tampering. Given the amount involved and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, she's looking at a significant prison sentence. After the agents left, Robert and I sat in his office surrounded by the wreckage of what had been a smooth-running company just 24 hours earlier. But underneath the chaos, something positive was emerging. "Carissa," Robert said finally, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt of gratitude for exposing corruption that could have destroyed everything we've built here. How can I make this right?" I had been thinking about that question since the moment I discovered Sophia's embezzlement scheme. I want to be promoted to Chief Information Officer with equity in the company. I want documented procedures put in place so that no single person ever again has the power to terminate key employees without proper oversight. And I want assurance that family relationships will never again override professional competence in hiring or management decisions. "Done," Robert said immediately. "All of it. You've earned it." As I left his office to begin the work of rebuilding and strengthening MidCorp systems, I reflected on how completely the tables had turned. 24 hours ago, I was a terminated employee, accused of financial misconduct. Now I was returning to work as an executive with equity ownership in a company that had learned the hard way about the value of competence, integrity, and proper oversight. Justice, it turned out, had a way of revealing itself when the truth was allowed to surface. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, watching Sophia Manning receive her sentence for embezzlement and fraud. Judge Patricia Harrison had reviewed all the evidence, including testimony from vendors, clients, and employees about the impact of Sophia's actions on MidCorp's operations and reputation. "Miss Manning," the judge said, looking directly at Sophia across the courtroom, "you systematically stole from a family business while simultaneously attempting to destroy an innocent employee's career to cover your crimes. Your actions showed a callous disregard for both the company's welfare and the professional reputation of a colleague. This court sentences you to 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and orders you to pay full restitution of $47,312 plus interest." Watching Sophia led away in handcuffs provided a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Justice had been served not through revenge or personal vindication, but through a legal system that recognized fraud for what it was and held people accountable for their actions. The transformation at MidCorp had been remarkable. Robert promoted me to Chief Information Officer with a salary increase to $95,000 annually, plus a 5% equity stake in the company. More importantly, we'd implemented comprehensive changes that strengthened both our technical systems and our corporate governance. I'd insisted on proper documentation for all IT procedures, cross-training for critical functions, and vendor relationships that didn't depend on any single employee's personal contacts. We'd established clear expense approval workflows with multiple oversight points, implemented employee handbook policies that addressed nepotism and professional conduct, and created a board advisory committee that provided independent oversight of hiring and termination decisions. The results spoke for themselves. Our cybersecurity certification, the training that had originally triggered Sophia's jealousy, helped us win 3 major new clients who valued our enhanced security protocols. The cloud architecture knowledge I'd gained saved the company an additional $30,000 annually, while improving system performance. The leadership development skills enabled me to build a stronger IT team that could handle complex challenges collaboratively rather than relying on individual expertise. Client relationships had actually strengthened after the crisis. Harrison Industries was so impressed with my personal attention during their emergency that they signed a 3-year contract extension worth $8 million. Brennan and Associates, Metropolitan Medical Group, and Riverside School District had all increased their service agreements, viewing MidCorp as a company that could handle critical situations with professionalism and competence. Perhaps most importantly, Robert had learned valuable lessons about family business management that made MidCorp stronger and more sustainable. He'd enrolled in a professional development program focused on corporate governance and had implemented policies that separated family relationships from business decisions. When his nephew applied for a marketing position 3 months later, Robert insisted on a comprehensive interview process with external candidates and ultimate hired based on qualifications rather than family connections. "You taught me that blood relation doesn't create competence," Robert told me during my 6-month performance review. "I built this company on merit and hard work, but somewhere along the way, I started making exceptions that undermined those values." Sophia's actions were a wake-up call that probably saved MidCorp from much worse problems down the road. The personal growth had been just as significant as the professional changes. The crisis had forced me to recognize my own value in ways that went beyond technical skills or vendor relationships. I'd learned to document my worth, stand up for my integrity, and demand accountability from people who tried to undermine me through false accusations or professional manipulation. The training courses that Sophia had attacked as excessive had turned out to be exactly what prepared me to handle the crisis successfully. The cybersecurity knowledge gave me the expertise to understand the technical implications of system failures. The cloud architecture training helped me design solutions that prevented future vulnerabilities. The leadership development provided the confidence to negotiate from a position of strength when Robert asked me to return. I'd also learned that professional security doesn't come from being irreplaceable or hoarding critical knowledge. True security comes from building systems and relationships that create value for everyone involved. My new role focused on developing team capabilities, ensuring knowledge transfer, and creating documentation that would allow MidCorp to thrive, regardless of any individual employee's presence or absence. The deepest satisfaction came from mentoring junior IT staff who joined our team after the restructuring. Working with bright, eager professionals who valued learning and collaboration reminded me why I'd fallen in love with technology work in the first place. Watching them grow and succeed felt more rewarding than any personal recognition or financial compensation. As I reflected on everything that had happened, the most important lesson became clear. Competence, integrity, and preparation create a kind of security that no amount of politics or favoritism can undermine. People who try to tear others down to advance their own positions ultimately expose their own weaknesses and limitations. Sophia had seen my professional growth as a threat to her influence with Robert, but she'd fundamentally misunderstood how trust and respect actually work in business relationships. Robert valued my contributions because they created real value for the company and its clients. That value couldn't be diminished by false accusations or family manipulation. The attempted destruction of my career had instead revealed my true worth and exposed corruption that threatened the entire company. Sometimes the people who try to hurt us end up giving us the greatest opportunities to demonstrate our strength and character. Standing in my corner office 6 months later, looking out at the parking lot where I'd carried a box of personal belongings in what felt like defeat, I understood that some victories require enduring injustice long enough for truth to surface. The patience to document evidence, the courage to demand accountability, and the wisdom to recognize that justice often takes time had transformed a potentially career-ending crisis into the foundation for greater success than I'd ever imagined possible. Today, MidCorp Technologies is stronger, more secure, and more successful than it has ever been. Our employees work in an environment where merit matters more than relationships, where professional development is valued and supported, and where accountability applies equally to everyone regardless of their family connections or personal friendships. Most importantly, I wake up each morning knowing that I work for a company that values integrity, supports growth, and operates according to principles that can withstand any crisis or challenge that comes our way. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone tried to undermine your professional reputation or career advancement? How did you handle it? And what would you do differently if you faced a similar challenge today? I'd love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of documenting your value and standing up for your integrity in the workplace. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming professional challenges and building careers based on competence and character. Thank you for listening. And remember, your true worth can't be diminished by people who don't understand or appreciate your contributions. Sometimes the greatest victories come from enduring temporary injustice while working toward lasting positive change.